I have launched 40 ships down the ways of my yard, and I have never once seen a room go as still as it did the night Anton Vogel raised his glass at a girl in a gray wool dress and said she had no business sitting at a piano at all. My name is Ezra Coote, and that year I owned the yard that built the Caledon Star, a steel-hulled steamer bound for the Canada trade, and it was her launch we were celebrating that October evening in 1898. She had gone down the ways that afternoon under a gray Belfast sky, the champagne bottle cracking clean against her bow. And by the time the sun went down, we had all moved indoors, out of the wind off the Lagan, into the long reception hall above my offices, where the real celebration was to happen. Champagne, gaslight, the smell of fresh varnish still clinging to the timber panels behind the wallpaper, 300 guests in evening dress, and at the center of it all, invited at great expense from Hamburg by way of Dublin, the pianist Herr Anton Vogel, whose hands, it was said, could make a piano weep or roar as he pleased. I had heard him play once before, in a Dublin concert hall, and I had thought then that I had never seen a man so entirely certain of the space he occupied in a room. That certainty had not diminished by the time he arrived at my yard. He had played for us after dinner, a Chopin ballade, thunderous and glittering, the kind of playing that makes grown men set down their cigars mid-draw and grown women forget, for a moment, the ache in their dancing feet. He knew exactly what he had done to the room, and he wore that knowledge the way another man wears a good coat, easily, without thinking twice about the cut of it. It was in the hush after that piece, while the applause was still dying and the ladies were dabbing their eyes with gloved fingers, that I heard old Constable, my harbor master, a broad, decent man who had never in his life said a careless word about anyone, lean toward his wife and say, not quietly enough, "Aye, that's fine, but you should hear wee Morag Dunmore go at the upright in the drafting office of a Friday evening. I'd wager she'd give him a run." Vogel heard it. Of course he heard it. He turned his head the way a hawk turns at a sound in the grass, slow and total, and he said, in that clipped, amused German-inflected English of his, loud enough for half the hall, "And who is this Morag Dunmore who would give me a run?" I confess my stomach dropped, because I knew exactly who Morag Dunmore was, and I knew she was standing not 15 feet away, half hidden behind her father's shoulder near the window, in her gray dress with its plain collar, holding a cup of tea she had not touched. She was 25 years old, the only daughter of Fergus Dunmore, one of my draftsmen, a quiet, careful man who traced the lines of ships' hulls for a living, and had raised his daughter alone since her mother died of the fever when Morag was 11. She had no conservatory training, no master's certificate, nothing but an old upright piano in the corner of the drafting loft that the men had bought second-hand years before for morale, its ivories gone the color of weak tea, and a handful of childhood lessons from a governess who had left the family's employ not long after her mother's death and had never been replaced. What she had instead was an ear, I would come to learn, that could catch a melody once and never let it go. An ear that had spent 14 years teaching itself, note by note, in stolen hours between drafting errands, what no governess had ever thought to teach her. Fergus went the color of chalk. "She plays a little, sir," he said, his voice not quite steady, "for her own amusement only. She has had no proper instruction to speak of." "A little," Vogel repeated, savoring the word like a man testing a wine he intends to send back to the cellar. He set down his own glass and crossed the floor toward her, and the crowd parted for him the way water parts for a ship's bow, murmuring, craning to see, and I found myself moving too, because whatever was about to happen, I did not intend to let it happen to that girl with no one from the yard standing beside her. He looked down at her. She was small, and he was not, and he said, "Miss Dunmore, I am told you would give me a run." He smiled, but there was an edge under it, the edge of a man who has been flattered so often and so emptily that he has come to resent anyone flattered near him. I do not believe a self-taught girl from a drafting office has ever in her life played a note that would trouble me, but I am a fair man, and I do not like to see a man's boasting go untested. He gestured with one open hand, and only then did I notice what had been sitting at the far end of the hall all evening, half in shadow behind a bank of hothouse ferns. 2 grand pianos, twin instruments, their lids raised like wings, set facing each other across perhaps 10 feet of parquet floor. They had been brought in, I later learned, for a planned four-hand recital that never eventuated once Vogel decided, on arrival, that he preferred to play alone. Now they waited for something else entirely. A duel, then, Vogel said, and the word landed in that gaslit hall like a dropped tray of glasses. Liszt's Mazeppa. You know it, or you do not. It is the fourth of the transcendental etudes, the wild ride, the man bound naked to the back of a wild horse and dragged across the steppe until he is left for dead among the wolves. And then, he lifted one hand, as if conducting the ghost of the piece already, the resurrection, the triumph at the end, the man risen a king. Half the terror is mine to give away, Miss Dunmore, and half the glory besides. I will let you choose which half you attempt, and I will play the other, and this room will judge honestly which of us was worth the candle. He said it kindly enough, the way a man is kind to a child he expects, without malice, to lose. The opening is the harder half, I should warn you. The octaves, the gallop, no mercy in it anywhere. I would not blame you for taking the ending instead. It is gentler. Morag set down her teacup on the nearest sill, very carefully, the way I imagine she set down a compass or a ruling pen at the end of a long day's drafting. Her hand did not shake, though I confess mine would have. I'll take the opening, she said. A murmur went round the hall like wind through wheat before a storm. Vogel's eyebrows lifted, just slightly. The first honest reaction I had seen cross his face all evening. A flicker of something that was not yet respect, but was no longer pure amusement either. As you wish, he said, and bowed her toward the near piano with a flourish that was almost, but not quite, mockery. And somewhere in that almost, I believe he had already begun, without knowing it, to lose. I want you to understand what she was walking toward. Mazeppa is not a piece one stumbles through by ear on a Friday evening. The opening alone is a punishing cascade of octaves flung the length of the keyboard at a gallop, both hands driven like horses under the whip in savage unison. No room for a single hesitation, no mercy for a memory that falters even once. I had heard Morag play hymns and folk airs on that battered upright. Lovely, warm, unhurried things. But I had never heard her attempt anything resembling this, and I do not believe anyone in that hall besides Morag herself believed she could survive it. She sat. She smoothed her gray skirt once beneath her, an old habit I had seen her father share over his drafting board. And then she did not look at Vogel, and she did not look at the crowd pressing closer now on every side, and she did not look at her father, who had gone very still by the window, with his hand pressed flat against his own chest, as though holding his heart bodily in place. She looked only at the keys, the way I imagined she looked at a fresh sheet of drafting paper before the first line of a hull went down onto it, as though the whole shape of the thing was already there, complete and waiting, needing only her hand to trace what already existed in the air. Then she began, and the room forgot how to breathe. The opening octaves came down like a whip crack, hard and clean, no fumbling, no apology, and I swear, the twin piano beside her seemed to answer in sympathetic shudder before Vogel had touched a single key of his own. Her hands moved the length of the keyboard in great tearing leaps, left and right in savage unison, wrists loose and driving, and yet under the sheer violence of it there was a shape, an unmistakable shape, a gallop with a bound man's terror threaded through every bar, and I understood then, watching her wrists, her shoulders, the fierce private concentration carved into her face, that this was not a girl performing tricks she had memorized by rote from a page. She was inside the piece. She had ridden that horse across that steppe 1,000 times already, in the quiet of the drafting loft, with nobody listening but the harbor gulls outside the window. And now, at last, somebody was listening, and she gave it to us entire. The chords built and built, the tempo never once slackening, though sweat had begun to shine at her temple. And there came the passage. I have heard it named since, by men in Belfast who claim to know such things. The great tremolo climb, where the music seems to claw its way up a sheer cliff face, one desperate handhold at a time, and she took it without a single stumble, her small hands somehow spanning distances I would not have credited to hands twice their size. Somewhere behind me, a woman gasped aloud and did not apologize for it. Somewhere to my left, old Constable had his fist pressed hard against his mouth, his eyes bright and wet above it. And Fergus Dunmore, God keep him, was weeping without any shame at all, tears running clean into his collar, making no move whatsoever to wipe them away. Twice more the music seemed to gather itself and fling itself higher, the octaves widening, the pace never once forgiving, and I found my own hands had curled themselves into fists at my sides, without my ever deciding to make them do so. She finished her half on a crashing, unresolved chord that seemed to hang in the rafters like gun smoke over a battlefield, refusing to settle, and then she lifted her hands from the keys and folded them quietly in her lap, and the silence that followed was the loudest silence I have ever stood inside in the whole of my life. Then the hall broke apart. I do not know another way to say it. 300 people who had come that night to admire a ship found themselves on their feet as one body, some of them shouting, some of them simply pounding their palms together until the sound rolled and rolled, the ovation going on and on until the very chandeliers overhead seemed to tremble with it, glass ringing faintly against glass. And through all of it, Morag Dunmore sat with her hands folded and her cheeks scarlet, not from pride, I think, but from the sheer astonishment of having survived her own daring in front of the whole watching world. I looked for Vogel. He had not moved from where he stood beside the second piano, one hand resting on its closed lid, as though for support. His face had lost its amusement entirely, and in its place was something I had not expected to see there. Not anger, not even wounded pride, but a kind of stunned, dawning respect, the unmistakable look of a man who has thrown down a gauntlet, fully expecting no one to lift it from the floor, and has watched instead, as it was lifted clean off the ground and raised, gleaming, over his own head. He recovered himself, or tried to. He gave a short, tight bow toward her, more courtesy now than concession, and said, loud enough for the room, "Well played, Miss Dunmore. Very well played indeed." Then he turned to his own piano, to his own half of the bargain, the resurrection, the triumphant close, the passage he himself had called the gentler one, the one he had offered her as a kindness she had quietly refused. It should have been nothing at all to him. He had played harder things than this from memory 100 times over, on stages twice the size of my reception hall, before audiences far less forgiving than a shipyard's dinner guests. He sat. He set his hands to the keys, and for the first 8 or 10 bars he played beautifully, the great chords rising and widening exactly the way the piece demands, the hero's transformation beginning to bloom under his fingers just as it should. But something had shifted in the room, and I believe something had shifted in him as well. He was no longer playing to an audience that expected to be dazzled without comparison. He was playing now into the ringing silence. A girl in a gray wool dress had just carved into the evening, and every phrase he produced seemed to measure itself, unbidden, against hers, and come up wanting in his own ear. At the 14th bar, or thereabouts, I am no musician myself. I only know from what I was told after that it was a bar too soon for the piece to be anywhere near finished. His right hand missed its footing. A small thing, the sort of half-second's hesitation any true master might recover from, without the room even noticing at all. But he did not recover. His left hand faltered a beat later, chasing the right into confusion instead of steadying it. And then, in the space of 2 full measures, Anton Vogel's hands simply stopped moving altogether, hovering an inch above the keys, as though the music itself had refused them entry. He sat with his fingers resting on the silent keys for a long, terrible moment, staring down at them, as though they belonged to some stranger who had wandered uninvited into his coat sleeves. Nobody in that hall breathed. Then he lifted his hands away entirely, folded them in his lap exactly as Morag had done not 5 minutes before, and said, into the terrible quiet, in a voice stripped of every ounce of its earlier certainty, "I cannot finish it." He rose from the bench. He crossed the small space between the 2 pianos. Not far, 6 steps perhaps, though I have never in my life seen 6 steps take so long to walk. And he stood before Morag Dunmore, and bowed to her properly this time, from the waist, the full formal bow a man gives a colleague, and never a curiosity, never a novelty act at a shipyard dinner. I set you the harder half, because I believed it would humble you, he said, and his voice had lost every trace of its earlier edge. Instead, you have humbled me, and I find I do not resent it nearly as much as I expected to. I have played that closing passage 40 times in 40 different cities, Miss Dunmore, and I have never once had to reckon, while playing it, with the thought that someone in the room had already outplayed me an hour before. That thought is in my hands now, and I cannot get it out. So I concede the duel, and gladly, because I would rather lose honestly to true fire than go on winning quietly against a candle I had already convinced myself could never burn. Morag stood, uncertain, twisting her hands together in front of her skirt, and said only, "You owe me nothing, sir. I only played what I love. I never meant to shame you before your friends." "That," said Vogel, and something almost boyish crossed his weathered, travel-worn face, "is precisely why you must not be left to play it only in a drafting loft on Friday evenings, for an audience of harbor gulls and tired shipwrights, however fond I am sure they are of you." He turned to her father, who stood frozen by the window still, his face wet and unashamed. "Mr. Dunmore, I have friends in Leipzig who owe me favors older than your daughter, debts I have never once bothered to collect because I never before had cause worth spending them on. I intend to spend them now, tonight, before I sail. She will study properly, not because she needs correcting, God knows, but because the world deserves a great deal more than a handful of lucky shipyard men who happen to be standing near enough to overhear her." He looked back at Morag, and his smile turned entirely without edge for the first time all evening. "Consider it my forfeit, Miss Dunmore. I have lost duels before, in smaller rooms, to lesser players, and always minded it bitterly. I find, tonight, that I have never in my whole career been happier to lose." I saw her off myself, at the Belfast docks, bound for Leipzig with a single trunk, and a letter of introduction in Vogel's own hand. And I will not pretend I did not weep a little on the walk back to the yard. She writes to her father still, and through him, now and again, a line or two reaches me, of concert halls, of teachers who correct her fingering and marvel, in the same breath, at everything they cannot teach her because she arrived with it already whole. I will tell you plainly, as the man who owns that yard and has watched a great many grand things launch down into the water and out toward the wide waiting world, that I have never seen anything leave a room the way pride left Anton Vogel that night, quietly, without a fight, replaced by something far better than pride ever was. And I have never seen anything arrive in a room the way it arrived, all at once, in Morag Dunmore's face, when she understood at last that the piano in the drafting loft had only ever been the harbor, small and safe and familiar, and the whole wide sea beyond it had been waiting for her, patiently, all along.